Imagine a world where less than 1% of the population controls more than 50% of all wealth. Not just money, but political power, media influence, and the laws that govern us. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is oligarchy. And today we are examining how a small group of wealthy elites secretly take over countries, and why even democracies are not immune. Welcome back to the real economic truth. Let's start with a clear definition. Oligarchy is a system of government where power rests with a small number of people. These people might be distinguished by wealth, family ties, corruption, corporate influence, military control, or education. But here's what makes oligarchy different from democracy. In democracy, we pretend the people have power. In oligarchy, the wealthy openly admit they do. Or more accurately, they hide it so well that most people never notice. Think of oligarchy as democracy's shadow. It looks like a democracy from the outside. There are elections, there is a parliament, there are laws. But behind the scenes, the oligarchs, the ultra-wealthy individuals, are the real decision-makers. They don't need to wear a crown or call themselves king. They wear a suit, sit on a corporate board, and donate to political campaigns. Oligarchs are not just rich people. Any wealthy person could theoretically move to another country if taxes got too high or laws became too restrictive. But oligarchs, they've made it impossible to leave. They own the banks, the media, the courts, and the politicians. They've woven their wealth so deeply into the fabric of the state that the state cannot function without them, and they cannot be removed without destroying the state itself. The best modern example of oligarchy forming before our eyes is 1990s Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia had a problem. How do you turn a communist state into a capitalist one overnight? The answer was chaos, and chaos creates oligarchs. In the early 1990s, the Russian government needed to privatize state assets, the factories, the oil fields, the mines, everything that the Soviet state owned. But they didn't have time for a fair auction process. Instead, they did something extraordinary. They gave massive discounts to people with connections. A factory worth $100 million was sold for $5 million to a well-connected businessman. An oil field worth billions was handed to a single oligarch at a fraction of its value. The result, by 1995, a handful of men, people like Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Gusinsky, and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, controlled more wealth than entire nations. They owned the energy sector, the media, the banks, and they used that wealth to decide who became president. When Boris Yeltsin was losing popularity in 1996, these oligarchs funded his campaign, controlled the media coverage, and essentially bought him the election. In return, Yeltsin gave them even more power and protection. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was openly discussed in the Russian press. The oligarchs even had a name for their arrangement with Yeltsin, the family. And it worked perfectly, until one oligarch, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, made a fatal mistake. He started funding opposition politicians. He started challenging Putin's authority. And in 2003, he was arrested on charges of fraud. His oil company, Yukos, was seized by the state and given to state-owned companies. The message was clear. Oligarchs can rule the country, but only if they obey the Tsar. Now you might be thinking, this is Russia, this is a dictatorship. Surely democracies are immune to oligarchy. But you would be wrong. In the United States, oligarchy has a different name. It's called lobbying. It's called campaign donations. It's called the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington. But the mechanism is identical. A small group of ultra-wealthy individuals and corporations use their money to buy political influence. Consider this. In the 2020 U.S. presidential election, billionaires and corporations spent over $4 billion influencing the outcome. $4 billion. That's more than the GDP of 50 countries. And this money doesn't go to candidates who represent the poor. It goes to candidates who represent the interests of the wealthy. A politician who promises to raise taxes on billionaires will never receive a $1 billion donation, but a politician who promises tax cuts for corporations, they'll be swimming in donations. The same pattern exists in Europe, in Latin America, and increasingly in parts of Asia. In each case, the wealthy don't need to overthrow the government. They simply finance it. They control the media that shapes public opinion. They hire lobbyists who write the laws. Democracy becomes a performance, a show for the masses, while oligarchs pull the strings behind the curtain. Britain's billionaires have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population combined. In Brazil, a handful of landowners control more territory than most nations. In India, a small group of business tycoons linked to the ruling party have accumulated unprecedented wealth and influence. I need to stop here for a second. If you're still watching, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Someone who wants to understand how systems actually work, not the sanitized version, not the version that gets repeated in headlines, the real one. Here's the thing, this video took research, it took time, and the algorithm doesn't care about that unless you tell it to care. So if this is useful, if you learn something you didn't know before, a like genuinely changes what gets recommended next. A comment does even more. And finishing the video, that tells YouTube this is worth showing to more people. I'm not asking you to hype me up, I'm asking you to hype up the idea. Oligarchy isn't some fringe topic. It's affecting your paycheck, your rent, your opportunities. If you think people should know about this, comment. Tell me, which country do you think has the most powerful oligarchs right now? Is it Russia, America, China, your own country? Drop it in the comments. I read everything. Now let's finish this. What is the economic impact of oligarchy? In the short term, it can seem beneficial. Oligarchs often invest heavily in their own industries, creating jobs and economic growth, but only in sectors that benefit them. Infrastructure crumbles if it doesn't serve the oligarchs' needs. Schools fail if they don't produce workers for the oligarchs' factories. Healthcare collapses if it doesn't serve the oligarchs' needs. In the long term, oligarchy creates economic stagnation. Oligarchs become complacent. They don't innovate. They simply extract wealth from existing systems. They raise prices, cut wages, and lobby the government to eliminate competition. Economic mobility disappears. If you're not born into an oligarch family, your chances of becoming rich are near zero. And eventually, the system collapses. The wealth becomes so concentrated, the inequality so extreme, that either revolution comes or the oligarchy transforms into a dictatorship, as we saw in Russia under Putin. Venezuela had the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Hugo Chavez concentrated power in oligarchic hands. By 2019, Venezuelans were leaving by the millions. Inflation exceeded 1,000,000%, and a country that should have been wealthy was in humanitarian crisis. Zimbabwe under Mugabe destroyed one of Africa's most productive agricultural economies through seizures that were politically motivated and economically catastrophic. The currency became worthless. Oligarchy is not a relic of history. It's happening now, in the countries you live in, using mechanisms you probably don't even notice. The question is, when will we recognize it for what it is? And more importantly, what will we do about it?